instead. But then the other benefit of the move queen e2 comes to the fore, which is that you're vacating the e1 square for white's rook. You're putting pressure on the e6 pawn. And Alireza handling this early middle game really, really well. We're going to get a time scramble here one way or the other because the player's investing a lot of time in these early middle game decisions, Tanya.
And it's not going to be a time scramble in some kind of a rook pawn ending or a drawn-out minor piece endgame. It's going to be fire on the board, and they'll have to answer the questions with seconds on the clock. And you're absolutely right. The bishops need to be traded off because the pawn on g3 could not have been picked up. Alireza would have been the one picking up that bishop on f5. So really nicely placed queen. And now the h3 pawn is never under fire. Magnus slowing down to stop that knight jumping in from c5. And I see that Ivalbar doesn't like it. I also saw your reaction. You don't like it either, Daniel. But to me, it's also a very human approach. You want to not allow the white queen and the knight to do a ballet against that black king in the center after knight c5.
Yeah, a prospect of knight c5 was terrifying. So you understand why Magnus played b6. At the same time, it basically tells us that he's not going to castle queenside at all, unless the circumstances change substantially. This king is going to ride it out in the center. Maybe it's going to go kingside. I wouldn't rule that out, but at the time, for the time being, it's going to stay in the center. It might even move up to d7 to lend another helping hand to the e6 pawn. Right now, the f6 pawn is hanging, though. You have to find a way to defend it. King f7 is a terrifying move to play, walking right into the x-ray. f5, knight f5. There's a lot of options here for black. There's no question, though, that white has seized the initiative. And compared to the position like 5 moves ago, Alireza has got to be thrilled at the way this game is going. f5 is on the board. It weakens the e5 square, Tanya. So my instinct with white is to put a rook on e1, try to get this knight back into e5. Magnus needs to walk very carefully here. He's walking on hot coals, and he's trying to keep this knight shut out of the game. But look at the dark square weaknesses that he's creating in the center. This backward pawn on e6 could end up costing him.
And I really like Alireza just blocking out the king side completely with that move. You pointed out the dark square weaknesses. Now there is absolutely no attack on the white king. And it feels like the knights are going to have a bit of a knight dance, getting to the squares that they really wanted. The knight from h2 comes back into the game from that f1 square. That last move, rook f2, also comes with its own ideas. He's looking at potential doubling up on the e-file with the move rook f2 to e2 next, and also vacating that f1 square for the knight to join back into the game. Meanwhile, if we ask ourselves, what does black want? The one maneuver that I think Magnus can aim for is knight to g8, f6 to e4. Because I only see, it's on the board, I only see that e4 square as the one thing going in Magnus's favor right now.
You're on a roll, Tanya, and if the knight lands on e4, then all bets are off. But Alireza is like, over my dead body, I'm going to get after your e6 pawn. Now, rook h6 is possible. Magnus dropping the other knight back to d8, reinforcing the positional threat of knight f6. So Magnus is literally putting all of his eggs in the knight f6, knight e4 basket. If you're Alireza, you have to keep posing problems. You have these two tempi before Magnus slams the knight on e4, and you have to use those tempi wisely. So c4 comes to mind. a4, a5 is another idea that might be a little bit too slow, trying to get access to the c5 square. Obviously, you're also considering sacrifices, but I think it's way too early to even talk about a move like rook takes e6. Alireza is under 2 minutes. I would take the eval bar and throw it away because right now, this is all down to the nerves. It's all down to the player's tactical vision. And Alireza is falling behind on the clock, and that's really, really starting to worry me.
Clocks aside, if you don't even need the eval bar to really understand how good Alireza is doing right now, also playing energetically, your idea on the board, great call there. So time is of the essence here. Not just talking about the clock, but the board as well. Daniel, is that you pointing out d5?
Yes,
is that the big
let's
move
go. Here? I've played Alireza too many times. I know exactly what he's thinking right now. He wants to open up this board, but first he wants to protect the g3 pawn. d5, though, is the order of the day. That's a very, very scary move. It opens up the d4 square for white's knight. And Magnus is kind of stuck because if he puts the knight on e4, Tanya, it's not as good in the absence of the d5 pawn. You could even sacrifice an exchange on e4. Alireza is in the driver's seat here. Can he capitalize?
Look at his pieces. And look at Magnus with those two rooks disconnected because of that knight on d8. The king on d7, queen on d6 lined up on the d file. d5 would be deadly. It just looks like there is no harmony in black's camp. Knight e4 is Not as consolidated without the d5 pawn, also because white can use one of the knights to actually trade off the most active piece in black's position. At some point after knight e4, one of the knights lands on d2, and what are you even doing with that piece anymore? Daniel, I think this is Alireza's big shot. He has to convert this one. He has to find a way to do it. He set up everything beautifully, but that's half the job done when you're playing against Magnus.
It's like 20% of the job, because how do you actually capitalize, right? You've got all the assets. You have all of the perfect piece placements. There's a weak pawn on e6. Where is the crusher? 38 seconds for Firouzja. Magnus finally bringing that knight back to c6. Alireza is essentially just making moves, trying to keep the status quo, covering the b4 square. And I think his approach right now is to get this knight into the action, knight to e3. The big problem is that he keeps running into the issue of the g3 pawn. So Magnus, in a certain sense, has the easier game right now. He has a lot of ways in which he can improve his position. He can try to get his king evacuated to the queen side. That's a very dangerous approach in and of itself, because you're walking past the c-file. Alireza needs some Alireza magic right now, because he's 2 minutes down on the clock. It's a wildly complex position, and Magnus has all the time in the world to calculate. Alireza is basically trusting his intuition. I think Magnus is trying to decide between knight d5, knight e4. Knight e4 is on the board. Both players are playing for a win here.
I have a feeling that Alireza is playing for the win slightly more in this position. I still like
Exactly.
white's chances here. I'm going to say that. King to h2, just a nice little move, and you've got seconds on the clock. You just make sure everything's defended. And the first tactics by Magnus, using the d4 pawn being pinned against that queen on d3. But there's something that's very wrong with this move.
Could it be takes in d5? d5, queen takes d5. I'm looking for it. Knight e3 is the correct move. Just getting the knight into the game, saying, take my pawn. I don't care about that pawn. I care about my piece activity. Alireza is knocking on the door here. Magnus's position is just collapsing. Tanya,
and don't forget about a potential knight takes pawn. Do not forget about a potential knight takes pawn.
Yes, that's a huge threat. Knight takes f5 is a huge threat. Knight c4 is a huge threat. And knight f3 check, g takes f3. Oh, and you can't pick up the queen because of the fork.
Oh my goodness.
What a tactic. Magnus missed that.
Magnus just reacted. He just saw it. I think he was relying on knight f3 to discover check, picking up the queen, but he realized it doesn't work.
But how do you win this position with 20 seconds left? Magnus is about to escape with his king. It's not over.
20 seconds. Alireza coming in with all his pieces. Rook to e5. I think it's just really hard for black to make moves. b4 always in the air. He's eyeing that c5 pawn. If the c5 pawn for black falls, the position falls apart. And we see the blue arrow make an appearance. It seems like that's the way for white to go.
Well, b4 is basically a pre-move at this point. I would play king e7 if I'm Carlsen, and then try to put a rook on d8. Try to set up some sort of a threat. Now he's down to a minute on the clock. And obviously this is not the kind of position that you can even survive in, potentially with 1 hour on the clock. King e7, rook takes f5 is a possibility. b4 by Firouzja was a pre-move, but watch out. Knight f3, Tanya, is a huge threat. That's a family fork against the queen and the rooks. How do you defend against that? 15 seconds for Alireza. How many players have lost their minds in a situation like this against Carlsen?
Oh, and the queen is coming in. The dark squad weakness that we were talking about earlier. Queen g5, queen h6 ideas on the board. It might be time for the black king to run the other side.
5 seconds.
Magnus going under a minute. Alireza in bullet mode. But Magnus should be getting checkmated now. How is he surviving this?
Magnus's king has superpowers. It's impossible to bring it down. Now, queen takes c4 is probably a draw. If you take the knight, Alireza will have a perpetual check, much like Magnus did in the previous game, but Magnus is playing for a win. What a gutsy call. 2 seconds for Firouzja, keeping the queens on the board. Oh my goodness. Pandemonium.
This is still a fight. This is still a fight for all 3 results. I'm not sure what's going on anymore. It feels like the black king is absolutely safe, surrounded by its own armies. The pawn structure for black is doing a great job of saving that king. And right now, Magnus has extra material, but he's walked into a thunder.
Oh my gosh, there was a win there. I have no idea what it was. 2 seconds. Alireza made his move with 0.4 seconds. But Magnus at this point is just making 1-move threats, hoping that Alireza panics with his mouse. Rook to d4. There might be queen f2 trapping the knight. I'm trying to get a hang of what's going on. Magnus is probably just going to go back to d4. That would be my guess. No, he pre-moved 95 and blundered his queen. Or did he? He's lucky. Alireza's so lucky that he's 97. I don't think he planned for rook d4.
This is crazy. Alireza at 4 seconds, and now Magnus is touching
Oh,
the 10
Magnus
second mark.
blundered his exchange.
What on earth is happening?
Magnus is going to lose his knight. He's got to go g3 and knight g4 because knight d5, there was rook takes d5. Magnus is now worse. Rook g8
He has to
maybe?
give up a pawn. But then
Rook
you just
G8,
go king
King
f2
takes
and rook
g2.
king f2, I think, was the way to go. He takes
King
with the knight.
F2
Now
is
you
the way
can't
to
go
go.
rook g1, Daniel, because
Now-
h4 is hanging.
Now Magnus is going to win this game. Magnus is going to win this game because he's picking up Alireza's pawns. Magnus is now in the driver's seat somehow. This is one of the craziest CCT games I've ever seen. Magnus taking all of Alireza's pawns. But wait a second. Rook takes a6. And Firouzja's going to have that pass B pawn. He
One
has
second.
to avoid blundering a fork. A draw?
Oh my goodness. That would be unexpected, but
Yes.
also, and it is a draw. What a roller coaster! And both Magnus and Alireza react. They've got a smile. They shake their head. They can't believe it. Daniel, I can't believe it. What was that game?
Well, the craziest moment was when